So, Hugh, welcome. Great to see you again. When we last spoke, obviously your background is in education, retired now, but a long career in education as a teacher and a head teacher. You had particular issues with the way children were treated during the COVID era. You know, the fact that they were masked, they were socially distanced, they were unable to communicate effectively with their teachers in class because they were wearing these ridiculous masks.
It is quite clear their education and their development suffered hugely. The government data is there. The government reports show that they were 2 years behind. It was crucial that children attended school for social reasons, but for education and development reasons. And there were development issues. The issues regarding very young children showed that they were around about 2 years behind.
Mm-hmm.
So I campaigned for this, and I assisted other groups in campaign, offered them advice about.
But you were one of a relatively few head teachers who actually did, admittedly because you were retired as part of the reason,
yes.
But there were very, very few teachers or even former teachers who said anything. You know, this seemed to be imposed from on high, and it took an awful long time really for schools to return to normal, even though I think it became commonly known that this so-called disease was having very, very little impact on children, and they certainly weren't infecting anybody.
It is true. And I should mention the mental health. We denied children all the activities that look after their mental health. And why are we then surprised that there's a mental health crisis amongst our children, with something like 1 million waiting mental health appointments for mental health issues? All the things that you would advise a child to do who was feeling down, we denied them. School, sports, social activities, church, travel. All those things we're denied them. And then we are surprised that we have a generation in crisis. To address the issue that you raised, I have to say, I remain disappointed that head teachers or retired head teachers and education officials have not spoken out more clearly. My angst or my worry is that should somebody say we have to do it again, we'll be back where we were, because no one in authority that I have heard, and certainly not the COVID inquiry, has come out and said, one, we knew beforehand that these things didn't work, because the original pandemic, UK pandemic plan stated quite clearly that these things didn't work. And then as soon as it hit, we did something completely different. And they're not saying, well, actually, they don't work, so we'll not do them again. I'm not hearing that. And that's a cause for concern. Now, where it morphed into or changed into where I am now is the group of parents and groups of parents that I'd been alongside as they tried to access their rights to schools. Were asking me about their rights with regards to the curriculum, in particular the introduction of amendments to the Relationship and Sexuality Education component of the school curriculum. And groups were asking me, how do we access schools and what rights do we have in relation to the curriculum? And one thing, once I listened to them say, now the obvious question is why? Why do you want this? And once I listened to them, I began to think, well, my goodness, is this right? And as soon as I opened the research material, one particular statement stood in my mind. This is directly from the WHO. A child is understood to be a sexual being from the beginning. Now, for me, and I suspect for many parents, most parents, that should set alarm bells ringing. And that did with me.
And it's also remarkable, though, isn't it, that given the fact that the children had been essentially locked out of schools, that had been denied education, had been sent home for a protracted period. It was particularly bad in Northern Ireland. I think the kids were out longer here, weren't they, than in the rest of the UK. But the fact remains that right across the United Kingdom, in fact, right across most of the developed world, children were denied education. And then it would appear that during that period, when you would have thought that education authorities, centralised education authorities and the devolved administrations in the United Kingdom would have been thinking, how do we make up the lost ground here? How do we do everything to ensure that children are given the education that they need in terms of the national curriculum, in order to meet their commitments in terms of university entry, etc. But no, apparently there's a much greater focus on rolling out new curriculum elements and curriculum changes, which, as you say, relate to relationship and sexual education. This seems utterly bizarre.
I think it is fair to say that the resources, staff and time spent on this issue are ridiculous. The OECD said that literacy enables you to access education and numeracy enables you to benefit from it. Now, everybody knows that you can't exist in this world without being able to read. Now, it's unquestionable that reading standards suffered during the last couple of years. And the data is there, both from the UK and from America, for example, standards. But I would know that functional literacy is about 85 points, depending on the testing that you use. Now, there's a very important school time between the age of, we'll say, the age of 9 and 13, when it's very important that a child moves beyond functional literacy from 85 up to, we'll say, 90. At a reading score of 90, you access GCSEs comfortably, which, as you know, is the driver of our education system. But if you don't get up to there, you're lost. With all that means in terms of employability, lifestyle and self-esteem. Now, if you don't learn how to read by 13 and a half, the law of diminishing returns sets in. And it's incredibly difficult to learn after that. So the importance of being at school with additional reading focus at school between the age of 9 and 13, as I said, so what, P5, 6, 7, forms 1 and 2 in old money. And the children weren't at school. Now, that has a life-changing effect, in my view, on them. And you're quite right. Why are we doing this now when what we should have been doing is trying to get the children to catch up on missed, to begin with, reading and numeracy?
And of course the bodies that you made reference to, the WHO and the bodies that were heavily involved in the policy definition, which was pretty much identical in most Western economies, suddenly are getting involved in curriculum development and relationship and sexuality education curriculum development in particular. And given what we have come through in terms of the WHO's involvement in pandemic response, and that increasing supranational organisation, centralisation of policy, the proximity of the WHO with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and a number of these other globalist entities. My coffee machine's going, but I'm going to continue the question anyway. But isn't it strange that suddenly they seem to be making recommendations for these curriculum changes? How on earth has this happened?
Well, if you look at the amendments to the pandemic treaty, the IHR amendments, you will see that the WHO claims hegemony nearly over health, and it's defined, for example, in terms of climate and education. Now, they therefore appear to be reserving for themselves the right to write lesson plans. Their recommendations stroke guidance, it's actually guidance, and there are two, and I'll just, so that we're accurate, two documents that all parents should look at. The International Technical Guidance on Sexuality Education, an evidence-based approach, written by Hugh, and the Who Standard for Sexuality Education in Europe. Now, there's a clue in the title there, education. And they have written detailed, 70 odd pages of detailed curriculum guidance to begin with the United Nations, and it's passed on down to the school system. And it seems a huge overreach to me. I thought the education authorities were in charge of education.
But can they not ignore this? You know, a lot of people have said, well, the pandemic treaty, for example, that the WHO is trying to get ratified currently, it won't have any teeth. You know, it won't overreach in terms of national sovereignty. So why is it, do you think, that the education authorities are jumping to the tune of the WHO as readily as they are?
Well, the WHO made recommendations to the United Nations. The UK government signed up to the United Nations recommendations, which were the WHO's recommendation. The United Kingdoms then passed these down to the devolved administrations. And in terms of Northern Ireland, the Secretary of State, as you know, we have no devolved administration, but the Secretary of State effectively told our administration to get on with it.
And would that be the same in the other devolved administrations and in England in terms of the education authorities?
I believe so. Yes, the Department of Education, the political powers would have passed it down to the administration. Now, where it goes is the Department of Education would pass their wishes, shall I say, to the various curriculum bodies that exist here in Northern Ireland at SEA, and then there's an English, Welsh and Scottish equivalent. So the Department of Education, Departments of Education, they would have said this is what we want to see, and that would have gone to the curriculum bodies, who would have referenced the WHO guidance. So it would have gone round in a circle.
Well, and has there been any formalised process of parental involvement in terms of these proposed curriculum changes? And we'll talk a little bit about what the curriculum changes might contain in a second, but has there been any consultation with parents, or have parents had any formalised involvement in the definition of the curriculums, or does that fall on the shoulders of boards of governors or individual education authorities?
Well, in general, how many parents actually know their rights with regards to curriculum? The answer is very few. Their rights are actually set out in Northern Ireland, the Education Reform Order 1989, Article 4. However, it was emphasised in small print by the Secretary of State in Westminster. It's actually in Hansard. And it's underpinned by our education authority and our SEA. All the bodies say that parents must be consulted. But the parents themselves don't know that they must be consulted. And they don't know the result of that consultation. So it is quite clear, certainly in Northern Ireland, and I know there's a wider audience, and this is the lesson for, if I may say, for all parents and people, to find out how your own system works. I'm in contact with people in Wales and it's different, and people in England, it's different. For example, in England there are political appointees on the boards of governors. In Northern Ireland there aren't. Now, probably not a lot of people know that, but it is important that parents familiarise themselves with how the boards of governors are constituted. And what are the rights of the boards of governors? Now, in Northern Ireland, it is the Board of Governors which is responsible for curriculum policy. Now, the Board of Governors must consult with parents on the curriculum policy. Now, following, I suppose, a lot of noise, the Department of Education quickly started to consult with parents in Northern Ireland. Mm-hmm. And there's a consultation currently in place. Mm-hmm. But it's very rushed. Because what was supposed to happen was parents were supposed to be given information in advance. And it was recommended that there should be meetings in schools, leaflets prepared, information seminars, so that parents could make an informed decision about the changes that were being brought in. Now, that's the bit that hasn't happened. It's a very rushed consultation. Mm-hmm. Our boards of governors, just to finish that point, are made up of local people. Our parents sit on them by rights. There are church representatives on our governors by rights. There are teacher representatives by rights on our board of governors. It may well not be the same, and it isn't the same, across England, Scotland, Wales and further afield. Mm-hmm. And that is why individual parents need to know how their school is managed and by whom.
Okay. Now, we could focus now on the proposed changes to the curriculum to embrace some of these RSE components. What does the guidance, if we can call it that has now been fed through national administrations, what is the guidance from WHO in terms of the type of stuff that has to be taught to children under the context of RSE? Okay. So what's your particular gripe with some of this?
Well, there are two gripes. Firstly, it doesn't matter what I think. It matters what you think and all parents think, and it matters what their rights are. Mm-hmm. So individual parents and people have a right to hold an opinion and to be consulted on that opinion. I'll read two or three things out here. Mm-hmm. And I will read them because it is important that it's accurate. And the relevance is, yes, it is guidance. You're quite right. It is not at the moment tablet of stone. Mm-hmm. It might be a tablet of stone in other countries. However, if you are working in a school and guidance is issued by an authority, it is hard to ignore. Mm-hmm. You have to be aware fully of your own legal position as a governor. Can I ignore these? Because if it comes from the Department of Education or the World Health Organization, it carries a certain weight. Mm-hmm. So what are we talking about? The guidance for ages 6 to 9 recommends a curriculum content which includes sexual intercourse, gender orientation, sexual behaviour of young people, including enjoyment of pleasure when touching one's own body, masturbation, self-stimulation, orgasm, the difference between gender identity and biological sex, as for 6 to 9 year olds. At 9, gender identity and sexual orientation, including coming out and homosexuality. And the International Technical Guidance define gender and biological sex and describe how they are different. What sexually explicit media, pornography and sexting are. Male and female responses to sexual stimulation in an interactive way. Now these are guidance for 5 to 12 year olds. I personally oppose them. I think they're unnecessary. Mm. But it's up to the parents to judge whether a school is the right place for these. I have my picture of this classroom. A child who was unwilling to put up their hand and say, I don't understand Ohm's law. I'm not clear how that child puts up their hand and says, or in a class discussion, I'm not sure whether I'm a boy or a girl, or whether, or how pleasuring. And we're talking of 5, 6, 7-year-olds here. I don't believe a classroom is the right place for this. That is where our education authorities should be, in my view, should be saying, this isn't the place for a class.
Now, but there has been some criticism, though, of some of the groups that are arguing against these changes, in that they're saying, well, some of the things that are included in the WHO guidance are clearly not being included in the proposed changes to the local curricula, if you like, across the United Kingdom. And in Northern Ireland, for example, some of the proposed changes do not go as far as the domains that you've outlined in terms of masturbation and self-pleasuring and so on. But do you see this as being potentially an iterative process? In other words, are they going to take this in steps in order to roll out some of these curriculum changes?
Well, I think I would take issue. I mean, it's fair to say that the guidelines existing in many of the UK states copied and pasted the WHO guidance. So if the people to whom you refer actually look at guidance, they will see it's copied and pasted. The words overlap, the terms overlap, and some is just a straightforward lift, as it would be if you were somebody that was preparing these. The first place you would turn to, that you are recommended to turn to, are these guidance. It is true that the minister, the Department of Education rather, did write to school principals here in Northern Ireland and saying the changes do not apply to primary school children in Northern Ireland. Now, is that yet or ever? Because actually, two things. If you look at SIA's website, you will find the guidance for primary schools. It's already there, and it has been for 4 or 5 years. What's it doing there if it isn't going to be used?
Yeah.
And many primary schools are using it. And secondly, the Department of Education's consultation did actually go out to primary schools. Now, we will see.
Yeah.
But the purpose of consultation, and this is where boards of governors and parents must say, don't want this in primary schools. Now, it does require a line-by-line critique of exactly what is being proposed for Northern Ireland schools. As you correctly point out, those guidance and those guidelines are being passed down from on high in a cascade model. It is very difficult for those who are tasked to follow circulars and regulations to ignore them.
And it's incredible too that some fundamental issues that are very, very topical at the minute. A lot of people from the liberal left argue that gender identity has to be a sort of civil rights issue, that it has to be right at the top of the policy agenda. But of course, it has resulted in a huge amount of debate, in just about every political circle in the West, if you like. This whole idea of gender identity being something different from sexuality and biological sex. And even secularists like Richard Dawkins has come out and said that this is pseudoscience, anti-science nonsense to suggest that you can be another biological sex if you choose to be. You might want, if you're a man, to wear a dress, but that doesn't make you a woman. So this has literally gone across the sort of tribal divide of religious versus secular. And yet here it is appearing in WHO guidance for the teaching of young children. It seems utterly remarkable. How on earth has this happened?
Well, now, there is a difference, of course, between live and let live and propaganda in a classroom. There are two questions in what you've just said. Is it right and proper or insane? And should it be in a classroom? Those are two separate issues for me. And the third issue is nothing to do with religious beliefs or everything. If you are a practicing Christian or Muslim or a strong faith, you're entitled to be that, rather than condescendingly called, shall we say, a fundamentalist or a right wing, or that is your belief and you're fully entitled to that. However, if you are middle of the road, you're entitled to your view too. Or if you don't believe at all, you can still take the view that this is morally wrong. Actually, our own Northern Ireland curriculum separates the two words, spiritual and moral. In fact, Article 4 says that a school curriculum satisfies the needs of the legislation if it addresses the spiritual and moral needs of the pupil and moral. Now, I have friends who have said to me, it's too much. This is the person talking, I am not a believer, but I'm opposed to this. The United Kingdom and Northern Ireland has come late to the party. And because it's late, it's starting, it seems to me, to nearly enforce an ideology around the issue of transitioning and transgender.
And that discussion around transitioning, transgender and so on seemed to come hot on the heels, didn't it, of the COVID, the dystopian, regulated, authoritarian nonsense that was associated. But, and of course the so-called right, literally latched on to this as saying, this whole transgender issue is part of the globalist agenda. The United Nations Agenda 2030, for example, was referred to quite often. But it seems so obvious. It's like, often we criticize these organizations for being so opaque, but in this instance, they're actually being very obvious what their agenda is.
It does seem to me that the WHO has taken on world governance powers. The pandemic treaty, I can't believe that any sovereign government would think of implementing the amendments to it. It gives the chief executive of WHO amazing powers over sovereign governments in terms of closing the country down, lockdowns, masks, vaccination programs. I can't believe that. And now we're turning to climate change, and we're turning to, some would say, the stealing of our children. And that's what alarms me. I think I should say before, and then I'll revert again to transgenders. The government can't totally say who says this and the United Nations say that. In fairness to who, if you read the full document instead of just cherry picking, it actually does say, and these are the words it uses, one size doesn't fit all. It says it must take account of social, cultural and religious norms. And thirdly, it says a successful introduction of a program needs the engagement of parents. And it needs trained teachers. Now there are 4 qualifiers. You take your pick and they all say, hold on a minute. Just any one of those 4. But I'm not saying that in any of the small print, but it's there in the WHO document.
Okay. So in essence then it would appear that the UK is embracing this more avidly than it needs to.
Correct. If you listen to what the Secretary of State said in Westminster, in Hansard, this was all to do initially with women's rights and ensuring that women and girls were fully aware of the choices. And it was sold is the wrong word, as it was in Wales incidentally, to inform women and girls regarding unwanted pregnancies and their rights to abortion. Now, how exact, and CEDAW, the CEDAW report, CEDAW was set up here in 1998 in the wake of the Good Friday Agreement. It was all to do with discrimination, that's what the D stands for. How we got to here from there, I don't know. But the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission said this. Schools must go further in promoting gender diversity, meaning acceptance of the idea that children can swap gender or belong to some new gender.
Some new gender?
Now, I have a view, and the purpose of these podcasts, Jeff, is to enable your listeners and viewers to have a view on that statement. But that is the atmosphere in Northern Ireland. That is the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission's report.
I'm just to be clear, though, that's Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission. But is that the kind of prevailing attitude across the UK, in your view, and in other jurisdictions?
Well, I think we are late because Northern Ireland has different regulations. In other words, the parents must be consulted. Now, anybody living and working in Northern Ireland, whether it's in the civil service or in education, knows that the majority of Northern Ireland people will not want most of this. I put it like that. And the rights of the churches are based on our history. The church has transferred the majority of schools to the state, both Catholic and Protestant, in return for certain rights in the management. Actually, the Catholic Church still owns they are trustees. So they have certain rights, and that's hence the spiritual word that's in the legislation. But equally, if you don't believe, that's where the moral comes in. The moral rights. Now, it is true, and in fact the Secretary of State did say that he had said to the Department of Education, get on with it. And really that suggests that England, Wales and Scotland have already got on with it.
Okay.
And in terms of the agenda, what I was going on to say earlier on was, we are late in, but it looks to me as if we're going to be late out, because those countries that let us in, liberal as you mentioned, are now drawing back. Finland, Denmark, Holland, Sweden, Norway, who led us into transition from boy to girl, girl to boy, who led us in, are now having very strong second thoughts. And indeed, one of the people, Dr. Kalatali, she's Finnish, who set up one of the first gender transition hospitals, has now decided that it was wrong. Research that they followed turns out not to be the case on practicing. And what the Finnish Health Authority have said, any transgendering should be left until adulthood. Not children, adulthood. And our own NHS has now come up, there's a report by, I think it's a Dr. Cass, and they're now saying that the children may well be in a transient phase where they question their sexuality, but it's a transient phase. And that now there should be a clinical approach not a medical approach. So in other words, where other countries, including the States, went ahead with puberty blockers and operations, they are now saying no to that.
And of course, the implication, though, in the RSE guidelines from Hugh, in sort of embracing the idea of gender diversity, implies that these transitioning arrangements, perhaps facilitated by schools, would be acceptable. You know, there is that implication because it's embracing the idea of gender diversity. One
of the larger unions here actually said that teachers should challenge with their classes children's stereotype view of their gender. And they've produced videos for teacher training. Amongst the pages in front of me, I have their exact wording, and maybe I'll find it. But just going back to where maybe an early piece of research ended up with what was called a Dutch protocol. And the Dutch protocol was to do with facilitating and encouraging changing of gender, whereby initially they believed that children were suffering from dysphoria, they weren't sure, and this was leading to their unhappiness. And the original thought was, all right, you're unhappy being a boy, and your unhappiness is caused by the fact that you're a boy but you think you're a girl, so we can change that. We can offer you a medical facility that will change you into the gender that you feel more comfortable in, and you will live a full and fulfilled life. I think the word used is credibility. Now that was what the original pathway was. It was called the Dutch protocol. Now one of the people who initiated that was this Dr. Caltielli. And she has now found that's not the case. Something like 80% of children who have expressed these, I'm not sure whether I'm a boy or a girl, that gender confusion, actually grew out of it in the time-honoured phrase. And actually, the rates of suicide, she reports, and it's reported by Professor Hugh and other researchers, amongst those that do transition and then say, oops, I've done the wrong thing, are higher in the people who transitioned than those that didn't. So when the Secretary of State talks about scientifically accurate information, he should take a look at the NHS's own recommendation, which is that it should be a clinical management procedure. That's the phrase. The guidelines now recommend a clinical management approach to explore all developmentally appropriate options for children. And it goes on to say that allowing children to socially transition could have significant effects on the child or young person in terms of her psychological functioning, and ends with a comment, the evidence is weak. Now, all the research papers that I have in front of me, from McHugh to Littman in the States to Marr in Holland, are all saying the research base on which this was based is weak. There is no clear evidence. Now, a final point, going back to your overlap with COVID, this doctor says that she has been stunned by her, as she understands her colleagues' reluctance to speak out because of the degree of silencing that has gone on and cancelling that's gone on and career-ending issues that they've experienced. Does that ring any bells?
Absolutely. And it goes back to my very first question.
It does. That's why I brought it around.
That you know, people and teachers and head teachers have mortgages to pay, they have, the mouths to feed and families to clothe, and speaking out against some of this thing was career ending. You were in the fortunate position of having retired and being able to speak out and taking a position, but so few did. And I know there were a few notable exceptions in GB as well, but too few, unfortunately. But it would appear that the same thing is happening, because we get all this nonsense from liberal, so-called liberal organisations that are supporting and peddling this stuff, that by not embracing some of these ideas that we're in some way being unkind or uncaring or immoral.
Our own department is saying schools should be proactive.
Yeah.
Now that goes beyond making you aware, or even teaching. Schools should be proactive. I've got the exact phraseology here somewhere. That worries me.
Yeah.
The word proactive worries me.
And it also implies that if parents are objecting, that their responsibility as education practitioners, or whatever we call them, have a kind of duty to argue this perspective, because this is seen to be morally right.
Yes, I mean, you're quite right. Where were parents' rights in all of this? A parent, actually, our regulations state that a parent has a right, and the parent has a right to withdraw their child from these lessons. Just like a parent had a right that their child did not wear a mask, but didn't know. Most parents didn't know that they had that right. Parents have rights, but they're no use unless they avail themselves of them. And they must know what those rights are. Now, it is difficult for parents, as you pointed out, it's difficult for teachers, head teachers. There's a whole weight of authority on head teachers and teachers' shoulders, saying these things. But if you are ever going to stand for the rights of your child, now's the time to do it.
Yeah. What would you recommend that parents do, just in winding up this conversation? What would you suggest that a parent concerned about some of these new de facto regulations should do in order to make their voice heard?
Well, they've got rights. That's the first thing. Understand that you have a right to object. So your right begins with writing to the Board of Governors. Writing to the school for the attention of the Board of Governors, saying, you object to this. And you have a right as a parent to know the curriculum. In England, there was quite a high level of controversy over whether parents had the right. In fact, I think, was it the Prime Minister said you do?
Yeah, well, the Education
Secretary said you do. But it was disputed. Here there is no dispute. Parents have a right to see what is being taught. So you have a right to know what lessons are going to be taught, what's in those lessons. So you can write to the Board of Governors and say you object. You can write to the Board of Governors saying, I want to know. And it has to be remembered, in Northern Ireland, we are such a small community. The way our appointments made, many teachers will object to this. Many of our teachers, shall I say, are Christian-based, because of the appointments procedure, if for nothing else. And the teachers that I've come across won't want to teach this. I am very confident that the schools that I taught in, the teachers won't want to teach this in any case. They won't approve. They've got children themselves. And the point has to be made that the WHO are saying that this should be taught by trained teachers. Now, from where I sit, teaching in inverted commas this by an untrained teacher is a recipe for psychological disaster for your child and your grandchildren and mine too. Getting into what's going on in a child's head in relation to their sexuality, that's a psychological issue. And for an untrained person to do it, even if you believe in it now, even if you believe this is right and proper at an age, even if you do believe that, For an untrained person to do it is dangerous in my view. Now, I'm of the view that it isn't right and proper that it takes place in a classroom. It's nothing to do with, as you said, we should be teaching them to read and write and so on and so forth. But remember, the who is deciding what is age appropriate and when is age appropriate.
Yeah.
I don't think that's the who's right. I think that is a parent's right, or at least a local right, to decide what material, the material I read out, I don't think it's age appropriate for primary schools. It is a slightly different conversation for, it's a different conversation for 14, 15, 16-year-olds.
Mm-hmm.
And then parents will rightly have a view. Now, if you send out consultation to children, do you want more sex education? That's a bit of a loaded dice question, isn't it?
Mm.
So
It beats having to learn Ohm's law.
it certainly does. So, as I said, I think the biggest thing that parents have rights, but they have a responsibility to acquaint themselves with the information and with their rights. That is their responsibility. And then once they've made themselves aware, then they've got to apply their rights. Otherwise, it's meaningless.
Hugh, once again, thank you very much indeed. I think this is such an important topic, and I think many people need to be made aware of it, and you've succeeded in doing that in this conversation, so thanks once again.
Thank you, Jeff, for the opportunity. Thank you.